Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're well, and I'm glad that you tuned in with us to go over today's lesson. It's going to be out of session 9, 2 Kings chapter 7, verses 1 through 15, and the title of it is God Provides. You know, God can be trusted to provide us with the needs that we need, and we just have to trust on Him. And let's get into the story a little bit here. You know that people are drawn to stories of unlikely heroes. We all are, you know. The underdog who comes out on top, like in a prize fight or what have you. We're all drawn to people who are unlikely heroes. Well, we see in 2 Kings chapter 7, we find 4 men who were the unlikeliest of people to be heroes. They were shunned, yet God chose them to deliver the news of His provision. Now let's go into understanding the context a little bit. And this is from 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 1 through 10 and then 36. And some of us in 2 Chronicles at chapter 2, 21, verses 1 through 22 and 9, or chapter 22, verse 9 also. 1 Kings opens with the death of King David. And we know King David was a mighty king, and he was God's chosen. God loved David. So during his reign, the Israelites used weapons made out of iron, and they were very victorious in all their battles. We can see when King Saul came, that iron was rarely used. And really the only 2 people who had even iron swords at that time was King Saul and his son Jonathan. And we can see that when they, and the reason for this was that the Palestinians controlled all the iron, all the metal stuff. They controlled it. Of course, they were constantly at war with Israel at the time, so they weren't going to provide anything that could be used against them. So like I said, during David's reigns, we can see when King David was in power, they had plenty of wealth, plenty of resources, and they were able to get defensive weapons. They had defensive weapons including shields, helmets, armors, and their offensive weapons included swords, daggers, spears, darts, and axes, javelins, and slings and sling stones, and bows and arrows. So we can see that when King David was the ruler of Israel, they had lots of military might at their disposal. They had military weapons that were made out of iron. They had chariots and horses when the type of terrain allowed it. And then when King Saul came and was warring with the Palestinians, they closed down the metal. So the only 2 people who had swords made out of iron was King Saul and his son Jonathan. Now, in this week's Bible passage, the Armenians had besieged Israel's capital city of Samaria, and conditions were dire. Food supplies were gone, famine had set in, and people were starving. Some people in Samaria had resorted to cannibalism. Now, can you believe that? That kind of blew my mind. Now that's in chapter 6, verses 28 and 29. So you can read that at your leisure there. Others were paying exorbitant prices for food that was ritually unclean and impure. Israel's king, likely Jehoram, blamed Elisha for Samaria's dire situation and threatened to kill him. So here's the king threatening to kill one of the prophets because he thought it was his fault. So let's go in and see if we can understand the doubt that was going on there and any doubt that anybody might have had at that time, okay? We're going to go into chapter 7, verse 1 and 2. Elisha replied, "Hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Lord says. About this time tomorrow at Samaria's gate, 6 quarts of fine flour will sell for a half ounce of silver, and 12 quarts of barley will sell for a half ounce of silver. Then the captain, the king's right-hand man, responded to the man of God. Look, even if the Lord were to make windows in heaven, could this really happen? Elisha announced, you will see it with your own eyes, but you won't eat any of it. Now, hearing the king's threats, Elisha replied by saying, hear the word of the Lord. And he spoke a message of hope, promising that tomorrow 6 quarts of flour or 12 quarts of barley would sell for a half an ounce of silver at the city gate. Now that's hope and promise from a city that was starving to death and resorting to cannibalism. So let's put this in perspective now. At that time of Elisha spoke these words, the people of Samaria were exchanging 34 ounces of silver for a donkey's head and 2 ounces of silver for a cup of dove's dung, both of which they were eating. They were eating donkey heads and dove's dung. And they were paying exorbitant prices for this stuff. So given the current state of hunger and starvation in Samaria at this time, Elisha's words sounded absurd. He was declaring that the famine would be over. So people were having some doubt there. I mean, he's telling us that it's going to be over, but I kind of doubt that. Look at, I'm having to pay 34 ounces of silver for a donkey's head to eat. Well, the king's right-hand man responded. He was full of doubt. He said, even if God himself were to intervene, could this really happen? He didn't know our God, did he? As we sometimes do, he was just speaking out of his own limited experience and understanding. He knew the king was unable to alleviate the people's suffering. So what could this prophet do? Comparing Elisha with the king's right-hand man, what we see is a stark contrast between scarcity and abundance, little and much. Yeah. Insufficiency versus plenty. Plenty of food, belief, and ability. Elisha proclaimed that the king's right-hand man would see the abundant food with his own eyes, but he would not enjoy any of it. And I think that's because he doubted. He doubted the man of God. He doubted what God had told and what God had told Elisha to say. So let's look at verses 3 and 4 and see what goes on here. Now 4 men with a skin disease were at the entrance to the city gate. They said to each other, why just sit here until we die? If we say, let's go into the city, we would die there because the famine is in the city. But if we say here, we will also die. So now, come on, let's surrender to the Aramean camp, and they may let us live. And if we live, that would be great. And if they kill us, we're going to die anyway. So let's see what those two verses says here. Now, speaking through the prophet, God promised that the famine would be over within 24 hours. God promised that. He's going to do that. And as he often does, God worked in an unexpected way through unexpected people. Now, these unexpected people were these 4 men with a skin disease. They had leprosy, probably. That's the skin disease at the time. They were sitting outside the city gate because they weren't allowed to go in. And even if they'd went in, they would have starved in there. And if they stayed out there, well, they could be killed when the Armenians attacked. So either way, they were kind of like dead men sitting waiting. So we can see that they knew that inside the city, people were hungry, and outside was the military camp of the enemy. Now, they reasoned that entering the city would mean that they'd die of starvation. And if they stayed at the city gate, it meant they would also die likely of exposure, hunger, or by an arrow from the enemy camp. Their only hope of survival was to surrender to the Armenians, thinking maybe that they would let them live rather than kill them. They were willing to take the risk. They knew that they were going to die either way, so why not take the risk? Maybe they'd luck out, and these guys, enemy would take them in and feed them, and maybe they may be a prisoner, but they'd be fed. So we can find examples throughout the scriptures of individuals in seemingly horrible situations that the Lord used for His glory. Take Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. Think of Daniel in the lion's den. What about Paul in the Philippine jail, or John in exile to the Isles of Patmos? We can add to that list the 4 unnamed lepers at the city gate of Samaria. You know, these examples can motivate us to ask, when we find ourselves in an awful situation, how might the Lord use this in a way that brings Him glory? Now, I know that if you're like me, I've been what I thought some awful situations, and I'm sure you have too. So how do you think God could have used us to bring glory to Him if we'd been brave enough to speak the word? Let's look at verses 5 through 8 now. And it says, "So the diseased man got up at twilight to go to the Armenians' camp. When they came to the camp's edge, they discovered that no one was there. For the Lord had caused the Armenian camp to hear the sound of chariots, horses, and a large army. The Armenians had said to each other, 'The king of Israel must have hired the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Egypt to attack us.' So they had gotten up and fled at twilight, abandoning their tents, horses, and donkeys. The camp was intact, and they had fled for their lives. When these diseased men came to the edge of the camp, they went into a tent to eat and drink. They picked up the silver and gold, clothing, and went off and hid them. They came back and entered another tent, picked up things, and hid them too." So, we can see that God's timing is always perfect. Always. These 4 lepers approached the Armenians' camp at twilight, and from one direction they went in and the soldiers fled out the other. So the military combatants left as if God caused them to hear the sound of the chariots and horsemen and a large army. They were afraid because God put this sound in their head. So they reasoned that Israel's king had hired the help of the Hittites and the Egyptians to help him. So they fled for their lives, leaving behind all their supplies. So when the 4 lepers arrived, they discovered the camp was intact but abandoned. Now, can you imagine the conversation they had with each other? Once they went in and found all this stuff in the tents, they found food, drink, silver, gold, and clothing. These 4 had been desperate. They were hungry, they were destitute, and suddenly they found themselves filled with amazing wealth. They made multiple trips, and they went off and hid their newfound wealth and riches some distance from the camp. So they who had nothing all of a sudden became wealthy. They who were lepers all of a sudden had all this wealth and this food and all this clothing. What about that? God works in so many amazing ways with people that He uses. Let's look at verses 9 through 11 now, as we wind this down. And we're going to see that the announcement of all this takes place. Then they said to each other, "We're not doing the right thing." Can you imagine that? People who were shunned, who shouldn't have cared anything about the people on the inside of the wall. They said, "We're not doing the right thing here by taking all this." Today is the day of good news. If we are silent and wait until morning, our punishment will catch up with us. So let's go tell the king's household. The diseased men came and called to the city's gatekeepers and told them, "We went to the Armenian camp and no one was there. No human sounds. There was nothing but tethered horses and donkeys, and the tents were intact." The gatekeepers called out, and news was reported to the king's household. Now the 4 lepers, they were concerned about avoiding punishment. saying they knew that keeping the good news to themselves was not right. They thus decided to go tell the king's household. The Armenians had left the camp in a rush because of fear. The four lepers likely also left the camp hurriedly, but to announce the good news. They weren't afraid. They were going to go announce the good news. Now, I hope you see that there's a biblical principle at work here. From everyone who has been given much, much will be required. And from the one who has been entrusted with much, even more will be expected. That's taken from Luke chapter 12, verse 48. You see, as God's people, we are stewards of what God entrusted to us. Whether it's education, riches, time, or resources, we are to share what God has given to each one of us. See, the diseased men returned to Samaria and reported the good news of what they had found. Their news spread from the city gate to the king's household. The outcast became the bearer of good news and hope. Now let's see what this next session. Let's see how skeptical things are, and see what happens here, and see what goes on. And we're going to be looking at verses 12 through 15. So the king got up in the night and said to his servants, "Let me tell you what the Armenians have done to us. They know we are starving, so they left the camp to hide in the open country, thinking, when they come out of the city, we'll take them alive and go into the city." But one of his servants responded, "Please let messengers take 5 of the horses that are left in the city. Their fate is like the entire Israelite community who will die, so let's send them and see." The messenger took 2 chariots with horses, and the king sent them after the Armenian army, saying, "Go and see." So they followed them as far as the Jordan. They saw that the whole way was littered with clothes and equipment the Armenians had thrown off in their haste. The messenger returned and told the king. Now, the story of today started with Elisha offering hope. The next day, food would be plenteous and cheap. And the king's right-handed man had responded with skepticism, saying, "Look, even if the Lord were to make windows in heaven, could this really happen?" We see the leper's good news reached the royal palace, and his response again was skepticism. This time from the king. He was certain that this was a trap to lure the people of Samaria out of the city. Now, as a lowly servant presented, what have you got to lose if you send somebody to see? Well, the king recognized the logic, and he dispatched chariots with horses and riders and gave simple instructions: go and see. They returned and reported to the king what they had seen. So the skeptics were proven wrong. The leper's report was accurate. So we can see the moral of this story is Elisha's prophecy came true. The people of Samaria went out and plundered the Iranian camp. Afterwards, food was plentiful and inexpensive. It sold for exactly the price that Elisha had foretold. Indeed, God had worked in an unexpected way and through unexpected people to bring about his will. This Old Testament story reminds believers of the necessity of sharing faith. Because of our own salvation experience, we know today is a day of good news. We have a responsibility to share with others the goodness and the grace of God. Some have defined evangelism today as simply one beggar telling another beggar where to find food. That is what the lepers did. That is what we are to do as well. We are to go and tell. We are to spread the good news just like the lepers did in the story today. They spread the good news. And God tells us that's what we need to be doing as believers. We need to spread and tell the good news. Now, let's apply this text to us today. Doubts in God lead to missed opportunities. When we doubt God, we miss opportunities. God provides in unexpected ways to us. And as believers, we have a responsibility to share with others about God's grace. People must be given an opportunity to investigate God's grace, and they can't do it if we don't share it. So let's go out today and be as people with skin disease. Let's share the good news. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's lesson. I hope you're having a blessed day. And next Wednesday we'll be back again, and we'll be doing the session 10, and it's God honors. So you can look at that in 2 Kings chapter 12, verses 4 through 16. You can go ahead and read up and be prepared and to follow along with me. God bless you. From Brother Tony and I, have a great day.